Hello, this is the final presentation of the assessing of the skills for the course Methodology 4. We are a group formed by Daniela Chavez, Diego Espinosa, José Miguel Morales, and Cristiano Ojeda. The teacher in charge of performing this assessment was Daniela Chavez, and it was in June the 25th of this year. The class was an 8th grade. The established goal is that students will be able to describe cultural characteristics of a country orally. The construct and its validity is the following: that students are asked to describe, which is a linguistic action that involves naming the characteristics of a certain object of a description. This process is located in the category of knowledge in Bloom taxonomy because of how much it depends on memorizing the content. Bloma argued that some of the axes of accessing speaking were intelligible pronunciation, knowledge of relevant vocabulary, ability to react in reasonable time and in relevant, meaningful chunks, and sufficiently accurate knowledge of grammar. Therefore, what is being assessed is the ability to describe features of the countries that they were assigned, and from that, the way in which students are going to present that information, both accurately in content and oral communication.
Okay, the established goal was that students will be able to describe cultural characteristics of a country orally. And in regards to that, the validity argument in relation with the curriculum is taken from the OA5 from the Unit 2 Countries, Cultures and Customs of mini document from 8th grade. Basically, in this OA, they had to present information orally by using the content learned in classes and using as well personal experiences, as well as information from other classes and other cultures or texts that were previously read or listened.
Now I will proceed to talk about the operationalization of the learning process. As the learning objective was that students will be able to describe cultural characteristics of a country orally, the learning objective was operationalized by using a checklist. For the validity argument, we have a definition from Gottlieb, which states that a checklist is a dictamous scale in which identified skills, competencies, strategies, or language functions are marked as either present or absent. Uh, on that regard, the descriptions provided by the checklist are very general and are not connected with the learning objective whatsoever. On the other hand, Gottlieb also defines analytic scales as a type of rubric that follows the specific dimensions of the construct that are needed to be measured. In this regard, this assessment should focus on getting information regarding what the students can do along the performance levels. So considering that the operationalization from this assessment lacked a real connection with the learning objective, we came up with an operationalization proposal, which is this analytic rubric, which focuses on the criteria or dimensions based on the correctness of language, fluency, factual information, and vocabulary. We think with this analytic rubric, we are going to be able to measure dimensions regarding what is supposed to be assessed, which is speaking and describing, and also to address the topic itself, which is the description of the cultures.
The purpose of this assessment was for reporting UTP parents and students. Therefore, since the assessment intends to be a closure of this measure, being worthy of 2 grades, it can be argued that its main aim was having these 2 grades because of the school requirements. It is also needed to mention that the intention of tracking learning is by no means greater than the pressure given by school authorities.
What to assess? Context. The context for this class is that these students belong to an 8th grade. This is a public school and this class has 27 students. The classroom is located in a second floor. The validity argument for this context is that the amount of students in the classroom allowed the presentations to be clear and well developed without any time constraint. Also, the limited number of students was easy to handle in terms of the acoustic environment of the class. Therefore, the presentations were developed with any constraint, and the classroom location also assists with the acoustic environment. What to assess? Communication. Students were informed about some of the elements pertaining to the presentation in regards to a described object. In this case was a country and its culture. Consequently, they had the opportunity to practice before the task. Additionally, the teacher gave the students a sheet of paper which explained the task. The validity argument for the communication stage is that students knew what they had to do because they had done a similar activity before. Therefore, they had the time and space to make mistakes. They also had the opportunity to ask questions to the teacher about the task. Nevertheless, we think that the learning objective was not visible for students before the actual assessment. And we think that what was communicated was the activity rather than the learning objective. Therefore, the communication stage was not valid. And we think that the communication was not valid, needs to be improved by, for example, showing students the rubric before the assessment, or maybe to create a rubric together in order to make the learning objective visible. How to assess? Assessment procedure context. The context for this activity was that students will describe the cultural characteristics of a country by presenting a poster orally, and they worked in pairs. The validity argument for this context is that as this is an oral presentation, students have to be able to provide key cultural features of the country, basically putting into practice their communicative competencies to describe the culture of a specific country. And the poster used for this presentation was only considered as a visual support for the students and their presentations. How to assess? Assessment procedure activity. This was an oral presentation, therefore we think that it was a fixed point assessment and a summative assessment. The validity argument for this type of assessment is that according to the Common European Framework, fixed point assessment is when grades are awarded and decisions are made on the basis of an examination or other assessment which takes place on a particular day. This oral presentation was for a specific date and is also connected to the idea of summative assessment, that also, according to the Common European Framework, summative assessment sums up attainment at the end of the course with a grade. It is not necessarily proficiency assessment. Indeed, a lot of summative assessment is non-referenced fixed point or achievement assessment. Therefore, this type of assessment is coherent with the purpose of this task, which is for reporting, as it is the final task of the semester.
In terms of expected evidence, students are expected to prove that they can describe a country and its characteristics in front of the class. The expected evidence should be guided by the checklist presented by the teacher. However, we consider that the expected evidence should follow the guidelines presented by Luana. Luana argued that what should be assessed when testing speaking should be intelligible pronunciation, knowledge of relevant vocabulary, ability to react in reasonable time and in relevant meaningful chunks, and sufficiently accurate knowledge of grammar. Therefore, in order to assess students accurately, the evidence expected communicated to them should not be a mere checklist but a more comprehensive package of criteria to prepare.
Now I will proceed to talk about the interpretation of the evidence. This is sample 1, which is the highest mark obtained by one of the students. Before I start to analyze, it is important to mention that most of the samples that are going to be shown were transcripted, as we were not able to get the recordings properly. So the first sample, which is a presentation about South Korea, we can say that most of the criteria provided by the checklist were addressed. For example, criteria number 1 states that they need to provide a supporting material. Even though we are not able to show what kind of material they provide in this presentation, the students did provide a poster with the main features of this country. The personal appearance and introduction was also there, considering that they introduced themselves at the beginning, so that part is also checked. Point number 3 is the topic address, which is address. They talk about Korea, they mention some key features and characteristics regarding the culture, so we can also say it's there. And finally, also the vocabulary related to the unit, it's also there, which is words such as country, music, and the capital of the country, things like that are also addressed here. So we can say that the checklist match with the criteria provided by this sample. Now this is sample number 2, which is the average mark provided by the students. So in this presentation, this is when the checklists start to have some problems regarding the connection with the learning objective. As the transcription states, we can say that most of the criteria provided by the checklist are addressed. Nonetheless, the main topic or the main issue that this presentation has is the vocabulary related to the unit, as it lacks some concepts that were taught to the students previously. But if we go extremely technical with this presentation and going and looking at the criteria provided by the checklist, they did provide supporting material for the presentation. The personal appearance and the introduction of the topic was also addressed. They addressed the topic, they talk about the country. The only thing here is the vocabulary related to the unit. So even though this presentation was marked as average, the checklist is not providing enough supporting evidence to say that the evidence provided by the students match with the actual checklist. Finally, I will talk about the last sample, which is the lowest mark provided by one of the students. Um, Again, the main issue presented in the checklist that I mentioned previously is also present here. The criteria provided by the checklist is technically in some way also addressed by this presentation. The supporting material was there. Personal appearance and introduction was also there. They addressed the topic, but finally, the last point of the checklist is not addressed because of some technical stuff regarding the learning objective and how it's being intended to achieve by this presentation. For example, most of this presentation is in Spanish. So in that regard, lots of keywords that are related to the vocabulary of the unit and the topics that are needed to be addressed in certain way using language are not present. So in that way, even though the checklist and the evidence provided do not match, there's also a problem with how the learning objective is being visualized by this checklist.
The data collected was used for reporting students' grades to administrators and parents, not for feedback. Therefore, it can be stated that this assessment was intended for reporting administrators or parents about the programs and speaking abilities of students, which is reflected on the grades they obtain in this assessment. Therefore, if some student did not obtain a good grade or score on the test, a decision can be made in order to help the learner to improve his performance and, in the same manner, his grade in the future. The grades present evidence about the student's ability to present information orally using the structures taught during classes. Also, with the score, it was possible to retrieve a grade to present it to the school directives. As a summary, we can state three main considerations. The first one is that the validity of the assessment was directly affected by the decisions of the host teacher, as the checklist she created was not valid, according to our opinion, of course, since it had no relation with the LAO, and therefore it was not assessing what it's supposed to assess. The second point is that the task was based regarding what is stated in Unit 2 from National Curriculum. However, the LAO should have been more visible for students, as communication needs to be improved. The last consideration is that the assessment was intended for reporting grades to administratives and parents. Therefore, it fulfilled its purpose, but its lack of validity may end up being a constraint for the learning process.